So there's a lot of people, one of which is George Takei, who are talking about preventing businesses from being able to refuse to service homosexuals. This is tied in with churches not wanting to marry gays. And what they will do is they will draw parallels to blacks. Okay. And I mean, I guess you could say, well, homosexuality is an action, whereas one being black is not an action, unless to be is a verb. But aside from that, it's not a thing that you do. You don't go out and do stuff, and that makes you black, right? Whereas homosexuality is defined by an action. So I guess there is that difference. But if we recognize that homosexuality is, for the most part, genetic, then that distinction becomes a lot less relevant. So, what is it about? It's about positive rights. It's about positive rights. It's not about negative rights. It's not about freedom from attack or whatever. It's about positive rights. It is about a right to, for example, someone has a diner and is serving sandwiches, that he is required to give you a sandwich. Right? He is required to give you a sandwich. I mean that's really what it comes down to. Right? So and the silliness about this, and I'm thinking about this in terms of Kentucky Fried Chicken, when they had the grilled chicken. Now KFC decided that in the city of Memphis they would not have the grilled chicken grills, because in order to have grilled chicken you have to have the special grills, and that costs money to install. And they came to the conclusion that not enough people in Memphis would want grilled chicken to warrant installing the grillers, right? That everyone in Memphis wanted fried chicken, and KFC was subject to public to a public attack, and I think a threat of a lawsuit, though I don't think it ever came to that. And what does this reveal? Well, when KFC was not offering grilled chicken, the fact that they didn't offer it in Memphis was no big deal, because they didn't offer it anywhere. But as soon as they started offering it somewhere else, then it became an issue. Okay. A similar thing is here regarding the diner. With any service. When is the diner required to provide, Reuben sandwiches to blacks or to homosexuals? When is he required? Well, as soon as he starts to open a diner. See? Before he opened a diner, he was not required to provide Reuben sandwiches to blacks and homosexuals. He was not required to do so. But as soon as he opens the diner, then he is required to engage in that exchange. Do you see how this works? Do you see how it's arbitrary and kind of silly? Another thing I get into here is the criteria of discrimination. There are several stores that have a criteria that says no shoes, no shirt, no service, and they will kick out people not wearing shoes or not wearing a shirt. Okay. And one could say that, well, that's okay because people going around shirtless or shoeless is kind of gross and offensive. Well, that's just like your opinion, man. And some people think that homosexuals coming in is gross and offensive. Well, that's just like your opinion, man. Or if you want to say, well, homosexuality and being black in a establishment, those are not offensive things. Or those are offensive things. Well, that's just like your opinion, man. Right? Or we could have someone come in who is politically motivated to not wear clothes and let their dingling dingle out there for everyone to see, and believes that it is part of their religious beliefs to have their dick flopping around out there. And if you want to say, well, that's really offensive, I find that gross and offensive, well, that's just like your opinion, man. Okay. And so ultimately that's the problem here. When you start saying, well, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, or you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or religion, right? When you start saying these things, you are erecting the criteria of discrimination. What you're allowed to discriminate on the basis of and what you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of. Okay. So when you have, right, and so this is obviously a slippery slope argument, right, and which has been, which I've heard, and I have heard it in university, it referred to as a slippery slope fallacy, yet here it's happening, right? We have the allowance of Africans, excuse me, not the allowance of Africans, the requirement of Africans, not requirement of Africans, the requirement to serve Africans in a public establishment. And we also have the requirement of the requirement to serve homosexuals. Right, just as you had the the requirement of grilled. Why am I saying that? The requirement of KFC to serve grilled, or at least you almost did. Right, you almost had the requirement of KFC to serve grilled chicken. So that is what you're seeing more and more, and and so if you want to say, well, that's a slippery slope argument and that's a fallacy, well, no, legal precedent exists. All right, legal precedent exists and is referred to. When you establish a legal precedent, it can be used to apply to other things in the future. Okay, to call this a slippery slope. Now, somebody like George Takei might be like, yeah, let's ride that slippery slope slide down to paradise. Right, that may be what he is saying. Okay. And if that is in fact what you are saying, well, so much for freedom. Right? So much for freedom, so much for civility. Okay? Because you have basically broken down the ideas of live and let live. You have said, fuck you to civility, fuck you to free association. Right? You're going to behave the way that we say, and we are going to limit the ways in which you can discriminate. Right? And discrimination has become a kind of a dirty word, but discrimination just means evaluation, the ability to evaluate, the ability to say, I want that, I don't want that. Really what people in general have no problem with discrimination. They have no problem with someone who has discriminating tastes in fine wine. What they have a problem with is people who have discriminating tastes in people. See, that's what they don't like, because people are special and snowflakes and right, all that kind of emotive nonsense. And so that's where the problems come, right? And that's where the emotional outrage comes. It comes when people discriminating against types of people. They don't have any problem with people discriminating against types of wine or types of food, right? Or restaurants. They have a problem with discrimination on the basis of people. So, next thing to think about is business in the public space. One argument I constantly get is that, well, businesses are in a public space, and when they're in a public space, they're subject to the regulations of the society. Aside from the dubious notion that the United States is a society or has a society, which I don't think it does. Aside from that, the problem though is that the state has prevented the ability of people to have any kind of business in a private space. Right. That is, private business has been basically not effectively outlawed. If not formally outlawed, regulated to the extent that it's economically unviable to start a restaurant out of your house, right? It can't really be done. So that's what the state has through zoning laws primarily. It has prevented one's ability to have a private business, a business where you do it on your own land, right? That is not public land or anything like that. It's private land. And they then come into the business, and you can decide who comes in and who doesn't. Right? That has basically been outlawed. Right? And so the state has prevented the formation of private diners that are allowed to discriminate. Right? And the argument that, well, we're allowed to make the rules of who you can let into your store because you're using our land, you're using common things. Right? You're using common utilities and all that. Well, I mean, if you want to get to like common utilities, well, companies pay their taxes, okay? And if you want to say, and moreover, let me put it like this. Let's say the mafia came in and required you to pay for their electricity, for their protection services, for their courts, for their everything. The mafia came in and forced you to pay for all of their versions of these things. You couldn't buy anything else any other versions of these things, and then told you how to run your business because you're using a public good. Of course, you're paying for it all first and foremost, and you don't have any other choice. See, so this idea that we're in a public society, well, it's nonsense because you don't have any other choice. Right now, there's plenty of and moreover, imagine that this mafia is saying that if you go into some empty land over there, well, they're going to do the same thing to you because they claim all this land. Right? If you drive around the United States, what you'll find is that most of the United States is empty and unused. Right? All this talk about overpopulation and stuff. Well, go out on the highway, or better yet, on roads off the highway, and you'll see just how underpopulated the United States still is, how much empty land there still is. Okay, so and one cannot get off of these public services and form their own because the state legally prohibits it. Right? The United States claims empty land. Right? And so this idea that, well, you're using public space argument, it's a dubious argument because it's not like these businesses chose to engage in the system. They were required to. There are no private spaces in which they can operate. And so this idea, well, you're operating in a public space and using public resources, no. Like first off, they're paying for it. They pay for the public resources in the form of taxes. They pay through the nose. So it's not like they're getting these things for free and then demanding, autonomy of their businesses. No, they're first off, they're paying their weight, they're paying their freight, right? And they're forced to do so. So this the public space argument is just nonsense. All right, now the arguments against. Well, basically, the arguments against free association, right? Because the arguments you talk about businesses being allowed to keep out homosexuals, or being allowed to keep out blacks, or Spanish, or Chinamen, or whatever, it's all the same basic argument, right? We can, the argument about letting in blacks and letting in transvestites, it's the same argument. Right, it's the same basic argument. The only difference is the preferences. Right. Back when it was allowed, back when you had the civil rights thing, that's just it was just kind of an arbitrary thing, right? The general public decided that, well, they didn't think that letting in black people into your store, or forcing businesses to allow black people into their stores, was something offensive. Now, back then, they would have found letting homosexuals into your store offensive. They would have found that offensive, right? And that's why, civil rights. There was not a civil rights for homosexuals at the time. It was just a matter of taste. It was just a matter of preferences that existed at the time. There's nothing moral or anything about it. It was just a matter of preference. And back then, the preferences was to force businesses to let in blacks, but it was not enough to force businesses to let in homosexuals. And that's all we're dealing with. And so. As for the psychology people who advocate this stuff, well, businesses that prohibit homosexuals into their business are not, let's just be simple and blunt here, it's not a very big deal. As in, it's not really an issue at all. It's not even a thing. It's not really a thing. I mean, you could say that it's like a major deal or something, or that I don't know what it's like because I'm not a homosexual, right? Which is hilarious because I am, right? And people go around assuming that like I'm. People assume that I make all these arguments and people go, oh, you must have a problem with homosexuals. Well, no, okay. I mean, I am one. So I'm thinking of the psychology of the people who are really for, really making those businesses let in the gays. Like what is their motivation? Like what is their motivation? Their motivation is not a response to harm, right? That's not the case. Okay, anyone who says, well, I'm just for helping the poor gays and helping for all the problems that they're... No, that's a fucking lie. Right, that's a front. That's make-believe, right? It's not a major harm issue. Okay, so what is the real cause? Well, if we look at what people are actually doing, people who say, and what posts get the most thumbs up, it's people who like to hark back to civil rights. And I finally got it. All right, these people are trying to do the next civil rights thing so that they can be the pretty people who advocated for the cutting edge left wing thing. All right, that's what it is, right? I'm the the progressivist of the progressives, right? And so and this also plays into all of these weird social justice things, right? You have all these people trying to, right? Because it's not enough today. For example, if you were, you know, back in the Middle Ages and you were, anti-feudalist and you were for free markets, where that would be, radical anti-authoritarianism, right? And you would be pretty radical then to be, sort of a free marketer and for the abolition of feudal duties. But if somebody who was like that today, somebody who was a free market absolutist and was just anti-monarchist and anti-feudalist, well, he today, right, those kinds of people would be considered, radical, Goldwater, paleo, you know, bordering on anarchist kinds of people who also had no use for blacks. Right? They would not be right. What is quote unquote left wing in a given historical context is constantly changing, and so for people to be able to dance around in pretty feathers, pretty ideological feathers, they constantly have to get more and more absurd, right? And that's what we see. Right? For example, workers' rights. Well, the problem is like that. The problem is they keep winning, okay, and because they keep winning, they have to keep pushing the envelope. In order for the next generation to feel like they are, doing something good. That's one thing, but another is to feel that they are something special, or that they have pretty ideological feathers. They have to keep getting more and more absurd, and it's just escalating absurdity. And it's not enough to be, unique, right? I mean, you can, like, for example, I am extremely unique, but I don't get brownie points for my forms of uniqueness. My forms of uniqueness ideologically are quite hated. Right? But they want uniqueness in a way that is kind of unique, but not so unique that they're all alone, and in a way that makes them loved, not hated. Right? Or if not loved, at least something indifferent. So that's what I think the psychology is. It's not harm, it's not genuine revulsion against a great injustice, okay? Because quite frankly, this doesn't really happen at all. Maybe you can find an anecdote here or there, and even the anecdotes are largely bogus. Like, for example, the Matthew Shepard incident. As it turns out, Matthew Shepard was killed because he was going back on a drug deal. Like Matthew Shepard had actually gotten involved. Like, these guys were actually drug dealers, and Matthew Shepard wasn't paying, or something like that. Or maybe it was opposite. Maybe Matthew was the drug dealer and he wasn't, given for the pay. There was something. There was a drug dispute, right? As it turns out, as we now know. Matthew Shepard was not killed because he was a homosexual. In fact, he had driven around with those guys, with the same guys who ended up killing him. He had actually driven around with them and known them for several weeks while he was a homosexual. They knew he was a homosexual. They also knew other homosexuals and did not kill them. They were not known for having anti-homosexual proclivities. Okay. And so the idea that they killed him because he was, right, and that actually came out of the idea that he was killed because he was a homosexual came out of one of them concocting this retarded story in an attempt for a plea bargain, right? That he was terrified of homosexuals or something and went insane, right? It was a kind of insanity defense that went with the Matthew Shepard thing. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent there. The short course is that the arguments against free association are retarded. If applied consistently, you end up telling people they can't discriminate. The argument that it's a public space is bullshit because the state has basically disallowed anyone getting out of the public space, has made it effectively impossible for people to get out of the public space. And regarding the emotional outrage of discrimination, it's just because people are narcissists and think they're special and think that they should not be discriminated against, right? It's a sense of entitlement, right? Like we look at wines and say, oh, that's a crappy wine, I don't want that in my collection. Oh, that's a good wine, I want that in my collection, right? But what you have is you have people who go, well, I'm not a crappy person, right? And in the olden days, people would go, well, you're a crappy person, I don't want you in my collection. You're a decent person, I want you in my collection, right? Well, I don't like black wines. I don't like black wines in my collection. I don't like black people in my diner. I don't like black people in my university. Right? I don't like white wines in my collection. Right? It's the same thing. It's just one is with people, one is with wine. The only reason it's an issue with people is because people are they have egos, right? It's an ego thing. I go, well, you can't keep me out, because I'm not bad. I'm me, It's childish and it's extremely self-centered. That's what it is.